Hi, and welcome to Coin Toss, the show where we respectfully and often vigorously discuss the big questions within our modern, financialized, and increasingly tokenized world. I'm Adam B. Levine, CoinDesk's managing editor of podcasts and your moderator for today's show. This time, we'll dig into a pair of hotly debated topics. First, financial inclusion. Can Bitcoin actually help people who aren't already rich? Then after the break, we'll dig into Bitcoin itself. What exactly is it? An inflation hedge? A monetary system? Both? Or maybe neither? For today's discussion, we're honored to be joined by two longtime veterans of the space. Alex Gladstein, Chief Strategy Officer at the Human Rights Foundation. Alex, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
And Brett Scott, author of The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance and an upcoming book on the global war on cash. Brett, we appreciate you taking the time.
Hey, Adam, good to see you.
It's good to see you too. So jumping right into topic one, as a tool for economic empowerment, Bitcoin has often been described as an instrument of financial inclusion. If you're a person or a business who's been denied banking services, well, now you don't need a bank. You can just use Bitcoin. But is that really true? Alex, I'd like to start with you on this one. Whether in the first world or the developing world, can Bitcoin, and specifically how can Bitcoin help people who aren't already rich?
Yeah, so Bitcoin's permissionless nature gives rise to the fact that over the last 3 to 4 years around the world, people have really been tapping into the ability to use Bitcoin as their own bank. I'll just give 5 very quick examples from 5 different continents, and then we can go from there. In Manila today, in the Philippines, country of almost 100 million people, there are many brick and mortar stores where you can receive remittances from your family that obviously is not rich. They have to leave the Philippines to work in some other country, and then they send money back to you, and you can receive that Bitcoin in the form of Bitcoin or in the form of pesos at these little stores. So it's obviously helping people who are not rich there. In Minsk in Belarus, my organization is part of an effort to help striking workers who are protesting against the Lukashenko regime, and these are very blue collar factory workers who decided to stop working and in solidarity with the democracy movement protest against the regime. So they're receiving Bitcoin from abroad in a way that no other monetary technology could help them. And they're using that to feed their families while they protest. In Lagos, in the capital of Africa's largest country, there are hundreds of thousands of people now opting into Bitcoin. The numbers from just one exchange alone, Paxful, are more than 1.3 million as of a few months ago. And people are increasingly using Bitcoin to do, cross-border payments. They have family working in the United States. That family may only be able to earn cash. So they may do stuff like they may buy gift cards with the cash they earn in America at Walmart, and then they use WhatsApp to send the gift card over to Lagos, and then their family sells it for Bitcoin, and then they use that as a savings account. That all happens in just a few minutes, what I just described. Mm-hmm. In Los Angeles, there's a movement built by Isaiah Jackson, a guy who wrote Bitcoin in Black America. Every day he's on Clubhouse with hundreds of people who are definitely not rich, who are realizing that they can use Bitcoin as a way to kind of get an advantage over the rest of the United States when it comes to having a financial asset that appreciates in a community that has long been totally discriminated against when it comes to finance. And finally, in Caracas, I interviewed one young man. He's obviously one of many who had to escape Venezuela for political reasons. He now lives in Argentina, but he uses Bitcoin to send money back to his mother, who's elderly. And then she uses that as a savings account, preserves her wealth, and then she sells it into local money when she needs to buy stuff at the grocery store. So those are just a couple examples of how Bitcoin, this is not a theoretical question, is already helping people who are not rich around the world.
So, Brett, I've heard you argue pretty eloquently kind of the other side of this, that although Bitcoin can often drape itself within sort of the trappings of something that's about helping people who aren't really in a position to help themselves under normal conditions, that's not actually kind of the story behind Bitcoin. So, I mean, we just heard a number of examples from Alex. Can you respond to those? I mean, it seems like they may be anecdotal, but what's kind of your take on this?
So me and Alex have had many kind of Twitter debates about this, but I think our disagreements kind of fall into probably 2 categories. On the one hand, it is individually, those cases are undeniable. All right. So if you take a small slice of an economy or a small kind of individual situation, let's say a microeconomic situation, perhaps, then those situations can play out. And on a small scale, those work. I tend to look at things on a large scale. So like what would actually happen if large numbers of people started to do that action, right? Which is a slightly different thing. Now, it's individually, I would not dispute any of those examples that Alex gives. I mean, I myself have used Bitcoin for those things that he mentions, right? So I have no problem with that, all right? Actually, Adam, you yourself actually exchanged Bitcoin with me for my book back in 2013. That's an example of a small-scale transaction for Bitcoin for a good, right? All right, but so my disagreement is not about the small-scale specifics. It's about the large-scale macro situation, what would actually occur if that was happening on a large scale. So what is actually happening in the Bitcoin system right now is that it's a movable digital object priced in money that you can move around, and that has limited use cases. For example, you can use it for remittances, as Alex mentions there. You could buy this object for money and then resell it on the other side to transfer it back into money. That's a remittance process. There's many things you can do. Another thing I would tend to dispute is that, and we'll probably get into this later in the program, is that Alex is tending to talk about it as a monetary system, whereas I would be referring to it as a money-priced object that has certain money-like appearances, all right? And actually, if you look at that example, for example, in Nigeria, and I mean, Nigeria's got like 200 million people, all right? So if you're looking at this, if 1.2 million people on an exchange in Lagos, I mean, that's fine, but like, there's a middle class in every single country, right? My family's from Zimbabwe. I grew up in South Africa. And I've spent lots of time in places like Nairobi. There are middle classes in these countries that have savings and they buy financial assets of various sorts, right? So if you were doing a breakdown of who's actually using that, okay, fine. There might be some marginal cases where somebody in a marginalized rural village potentially might be using it, but on average, what's going to be happening is probably the urban middle class of Lagos is buying and selling it just like the urban middle class of New York.
So, I mean, play that out for a second, though. You know, talk to me about so you're saying that on a small scale, you agree with the things that Alex is saying, but as you kind of zoom back, then that stops working. What about it stops working, or what changes when you try and scale this out that makes it problematic in your eyes?
I mean, that's a big question we probably have to slowly unpack. All right, but I think the best starting point, and I've been involved in Bitcoin since like about 2011 or so. And if you think about the early community in Bitcoin, if you went to the early meetups, people just sort of casually spoke about it as a coin and as money, right? There was this whole thing, which was actually most of the excitement in the early community was around the fact that you could issue tokens and move them around without a central party, right? And that was authentically interesting for a while, all right? But I kind of like moved on from that at some point. I was like, okay, well, what is this thing that you're issuing and moving around, all right? It's fine that you've developed a fascinating censorship-resistant permissionless way to move digital objects around, but let's ask ourselves what this object actually is. And when you start to do that analysis and you start to dig deeper, you soon discover that the object, if you strip it of its branding and its linguistic content, so you take away the term coin, you take away the monetary branding, you're left with basically something which is extremely ambiguous, all right? The best way to describe it is basically just like a sort of featureless digital object that you can move around very effectively, okay? Now, what's happened is that object has turned into a type of collectible, which you can buy and sell for money, but this collectible has money-like branding, which constantly confuses people. So they keep on talking about this process of transferring this money-priced object as a process of transferring money, which is a separate thing, all right? And this is, when you actually start to analyze the monetary dynamics of the system, it's incredibly crude and struggles very, very deeply, which we can go into more details about that. But that's the starting point is to not call them cryptocurrencies, call them crypto tokens until they're actually proven to be a monetary system.
So, Alex, let's bring you back into the conversation here. You know, like when we're talking about collectibles, when we're talking about money-like objects, like in practice, does that matter? Like, is it about functionality, or is the fundamental aspect of the thing important here?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm going to argue that the semantics don't matter to the people that use it. They just don't care. I mean, most people who use Bitcoin do not have any sort of expertise in monetary history or monetary linguistics or whatever. The point is that this gives anybody who has an internet connection access to money that governments cannot debase. And maybe that's not that big of a deal for people who live in Germany or the UK or Japan or the United States, or who have the luxury of living under a reserve currency. But remember, only 13% of people in the world live under a reserve currency and a liberal democracy with property rights and free speech. That's only 13% of the world's population. More than 7 billion live under either an authoritarian regime or a country with high inflation. And I mean, there's just so many countless examples. And, the governments in these countries actively steal from people, mainly poor people. I mean, rich people during a high inflation period are fine. They can take out loans and they can watch the loans disappear in their local fiat currency. They'll figure out a way to survive. You've seen this throughout history constantly. But poorer and middle class people get totally toasted. OK, and this gives them an opportunity to take some of their hard-earned time and energy and put it into a money that's not going to disappear over 2 years, 1 year, 30 days, overnight, depending on how bad the inflation is. So no, I don't think that the semantics we use really matter here.
So, turning the conversation briefly to CBDCs, one of the kind of questions has been that, when you look at something like Bitcoin, as Brett has been saying, it's an asset that can kind of fill a couple of different buckets, right? It's sort of branded around the idea of currency, but it's kind of a little more complicated than that once you get into it. CBDCs appear to take this concept and make it very explicitly about currency because they're, going to be issued by the countries and by the entities that typically issue currency. So, what are kind of your thoughts broadly on CBDCs? And then Brett, we'll throw to you for some thoughts on this.
Sure. I think CBDCs are inevitable. One of the primary reasons is that governments are frustrated with their lack of control over payments. You're seeing this most aggressively in China, where if you read the news right now, you're watching a fight, basically, where the government is ostensibly, if you believe it, not able to get all the information they need from these tech titans on payments. So the PBOC and the CCP are creating, hopefully for them, a payment system that gives them total control and it kind of pushes back the corporate sector a little bit. So this is like a struggle for the public sector to regain some control over the private sector. And Brett has written very eloquently about these different tiers of money, and I would recommend everybody read his work on this. And now you're watching a conflict there. The thing is, CBDCs, ultimately are just going to be mechanisms of control and surveillance to different degrees in different societies. There's this war on cash, which again, Brett has written very eloquently about. And I don't think kids being born today are going to use paper money, unfortunately, even though cash is a fantastic human rights and privacy tool. So when we look at the digital future, for me, I think we have these CBDCs, which are going to become increasingly dominant. We're going to have corporate money, which will, of course, always exist, and obviously is dominant today. But people will have another option, I believe. And CBDCs can't really compete with Bitcoin. The main reason they cannot compete is that their purchasing power will go down over time, and Bitcoin's purchasing power goes up over time. So they can't compete there. And Bitcoin also has transactional freedom from the state that CBDCs will never have. Perhaps CBDCs will boast, privacy from thieves and other people, but they will never boast, privacy from the state. And third of all, there's this permissionless global, anti-nationalist quality to Bitcoin. You don't have to be have a certain passport or be a certain ethnicity or be a certain, level of status to have Bitcoin. Anybody can have Bitcoin, whereas CBDCs are going to be very tightly controlled. And if you disagree with the government or you are sleeping with the wrong person or you have the wrong beliefs, they can take that away from you. They can never take Bitcoin away from you. So that's why I ultimately don't believe CBDCs can compete directly with Bitcoin.
Thanks for that, Alex. So we're almost out of time. Brett, you got 90 seconds. Tell us what you think about Alex's answer. Tell us what you think about CBDCs broadly and the war on cash.
So many things to say there. Well, look, Alex is speaking in two different paradigms here. On the one hand, he's speaking about the monetary system, which we can have a debate about, right? We can talk about CBDCs and the fact that how they are inspired by the war on cash, and that the fact that there's a Mexican standoff, as it were, in the monetary system, where the banks have undermined the cash system and it's then pushed the state into trying to issue its own form of quote unquote digital cash. But I mean, the CBDCs already exist. It's just called reserves, right? It's just the fact that most people can't get access to it. That's that debate. If you want to then talk about Bitcoin, it doesn't participate in this debate. Bitcoin is a money priced asset which you can buy and sell and hypothetically can use on the margins of that situation. So part of what we can get back to this after the break is, you got to be speaking in the same paradigm when you're having these debates. I mean, I used to work in inflation derivative markets. I understand how inflation hedging works, all right? But things that are in the inflation hedging markets are not monetary systems. There are things outside of the monetary system, and that's where Bitcoin is operating. So you can't use it to talk about the problems of CBDCs. It's not in the same category, all right? There's other things you got to talk about, and maybe I can elaborate on that when we get back.
You're definitely going to elaborate that on when you get back. Yeah, no, you're good there. So that's it for our first topic. Stay tuned for after the break when we'll dig into the big question: what is Bitcoin really? I'm Adam B. Levine. We'll be right back with more Coin Toss. Welcome back to Coin Toss. I'm your host, Adam B. Levine, and once again, we're joined by Brett Scott, author, and Alex Gladstein of the Human Rights Foundation. Thanks for being here again, folks. So for our next discussion, I want to go back to something fundamental that we talked about a little bit in the prior episode, or in the prior segment. What kind of system is Bitcoin really? Depending on who you're talking to, it's pretty easy to get different answers to this question. Some people believe Bitcoin is a monetary system competing or perhaps destined to compete with the dollar's current status as the global reserve currency. Some see Bitcoin as a store of value, and others see it as an inflation hedge, something you'd buy for dollars today and sell for more dollars tomorrow. And still others believe it can be all of the above. Brett, you recently wrote an opinion piece digging into this phenomenon and making the case that it must be either a monetary system or an inflationary hedge. So I'd like to start with you. What's the difference between a depreciating asset and a deflationary currency, which I think gets to the heart of this conversation? And why does that distinction matter when we discuss an asset like Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, actually, the best place to start is the previous version of this coin toss debate, where I was watching Trace Mayer do this exact thing. So what he does, he starts out by complaining about inflation and the Fed printing money, right? So he sets up this critique of the Fed printing money. It's like what a monetary conservative would do. There's too much money being printed. Then talks about Bitcoin as an asset class. Now, that sort of superficially makes sense, right? It sort of like says, okay, well, there is this money-like thing which will compete against this evil big Fed kind of money printing machine. But what he's basically talking about is an inflation hedging system which far precedes Bitcoin. So as I say, I used to work in inflation derivative markets, right? I was a broker in inflation derivative markets. So I've been around people who do inflation hedging. Now, inflation derivatives are bets that you can use to protect yourself. But historically, inflation hedging, what you do is you take money, you buy something for it, you then later resell it and hope that you make more money so as to compensate for the loss of value in the money over time, right? Now, that's an inflation hedge using a non-monetary object. Now, a deflationary currency is different. It's a form of money that everything is priced in that gets more and more powerful relative to the things it's priced in over time, all right? You hold it, and everything in the system is priced in this money, right? Now, that's very different to holding an object that you buy and sell for money, and the increases in price.
Okay, so that I think that makes sense, but I guess Alex, do you want to weigh in here? Because I could have this conversation, but I think I'll throw to you.
Yeah, it's difficult because we're trying to use like a paradigms based on our experience so far with the world. We can't predict the future, right? Bitcoin is monetizing in front of our eyes. It's gone from essentially an exchange rate of less than a penny to 50,000 US dollars. It has gone to $1 trillion in market cap globally, and it's just getting started here. If you look at the adoption curve of this monetary technology, it's we're at the bottom. There's an estimate of maybe 100 million people have used Bitcoin, which is just over 1% of the world's population. People like me believe we're going to fly past 1 billion by 2030. And eventually, I think what you're going to see here is and I'll just borrow two terms from the economics field, but right now you have Gresham's law in effect, where like people don't necessarily want to spend their Bitcoin because they know it's going to appreciate in the near term as we go up this adoption S curve, and that's going to be the case, I think, for the coming decade primarily. There will of course be people who need to spend their Bitcoin because they're using it for remittances or they have to buy stuff and they have to sell it off, right? And there are also going to be people who pioneer the medium of exchange properties of Bitcoin through things like the Lightning Network. And I believe that within a few years, I think you'll be able to easily buy stuff in retail stores with this sort of technology, especially with the backing of Square and Jack Dorsey and his investment into Lightning. So lot to pay attention to there. But generally speaking, I think we're in this early phase of Bitcoin where, bad money drives out the good. And I'm going to use my government script I'm not going to want to use my Bitcoin for daily purchases generally. However, there eventually, I believe, will come a day when merchants don't want your government money anymore and they're going to want your Bitcoin. And that's the opposite, right? That's Thayer's law, right? So that may happen when I'm old and gray, or who knows what. Could happen in 10 years. But the point is, I do believe that eventually people will be sort of forced to use their Bitcoin. And that's kind of how I think things are going to go.
Brett, why don't you just jump in and respond directly? Yeah, please.
There's so many things to try and respond to there. It would take me hours to unpack all the problems of what's just been said. All right. It takes almost like years of experience to see this. Alex basically in that last answer chopped and basically mixed paradigms so many times that it was like I couldn't even keep track. So he starts by saying exchange rate. Exchange rate's a monetary concept between two monetary networks that are used to price goods. Right? So imagine one country and another country. The goods in these countries are priced in that stuff. Then there's an interstitial boundary between these two networks where you can have this like crossover where people are trying to, and that's the exchange rate. All right. He then uses market cap, a fundamentally different concept. Market cap is a thing within a particular monetary network that's priced in money, and you take the objects, you multiply the number of objects by their price, and you come up with a theoretical maximum price. That's a market cap, fundamentally different concept in a different paradigm. You cannot mix those, I'm afraid. All right. This is what's like crazy, and using this term purchasing power. I mean, this issue becomes so much simpler when you just call Bitcoin for what it is. It is a money-priced digital collectible. Okay, it doesn't increase in purchasing power because nothing is priced in Bitcoin. Right? I can't go down to the supermarket and see my purchasing power increase relative to all goods and services. What I got to do is I got to sell it for money and then take that money to buy more goods and services. That's a fundamentally different concept to your purchasing power increasing. What that is you cashing out of an appreciating asset that's going up in monetary price. Okay? And then if you want to understand the supermarket equivalent of this, imagine going into a supermarket, buying an expensive object there, all right, walking out of the store, selling it on a secondary market to some antiques dealer or something, or whatever you've sold, taking the money back into the supermarket and then buying more goods, right? That is what is happening when you have an appreciating asset, right? It's very different to being able to go into a supermarket and finding your money over time getting more and more powerful.
Well, so I hear what you're saying in kind of the underlying nature of these things, but in practice, I guess the question that I come back to is, does that actually matter? Does it so on the one hand, does that distinction matter? And on the other hand, does it have to be both of these things at once? I think a lot of people, and certainly my feeling about the kind of trajectory that Bitcoin broadly has been under, is one where it starts off as this sort of appreciating asset, as you're saying, in an inflationary environment, but that at a certain point, it sort of becomes viable as a global reserve currency, as a monetary system unto itself. It has those characteristics now, but there are problems that sort of hold it back. So do you see those ideas as being inherently incompatible between each other? Or is it just you're talking about the current state? Yeah, go for it.
It's very core to the Bitcoin marketing story of this imagined future point where the price rises and then suddenly the system inverts and everything becomes priced in Bitcoin. All right, it's a little bit like arguing that the rising price of an Apple share, at some point everything gets priced in Apple shares, even though Apple shares derive their value from the actual fiat money pricing of goods and services. So it's like a slightly crazy belief system, and it's very much like this is why I would say it's a marketing point that you use, right? It's so you say, I have an object that's rising in price, and therefore at some point it becomes a monetary system. But in the monetary system, what that object is really competing against is other assets. It's competing against the stock market. It's competing against rare postage stamps. It's competing against farmland. What's happening is that people are choosing to spend their money on buying a Bitcoin token and passing it to a dealer of Bitcoin rather than passing it to a dealer of farmland. So in the system, the price of one thing is going down while the price of Bitcoin is going up. The US dollar remains unaffected by this. It's just the pricing mechanism, right? And that's what's going on. So what's happening in a time of global anxiety, people choose to spend money on things that they can later resell rather than choosing consumption items.
Alex, jump in.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the US dollar is greatly affected, and its purchasing power is going very far down compared to things like whether it's stocks or healthcare, education, gold. If you just look in the last 20 years, Bitcoin's purchasing power, I mean, I think, Brett, we can use different semantic terms, but obviously it's going up. Like one Bitcoin buys a hell of a lot more than it did two years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. This is not really debatable. There are some people who will take your Bitcoin straight for Bitcoin. Other people don't. And that's because it's new and nobody believes in it and we're early. Like, I don't think it would be reasonable to expect everybody to accept Bitcoin now. It's not reasonable. Too many people don't believe in it. There's so many Bitcoin deniers out there. It's not going to compute yet for a while. However, I do really believe that in the next 2 decades, for example, and this is like something that Preston Pish has brought up, which I think is really interesting to think about. People who sell their homes in a country like the United States will not accept dollars at some point in the future. They will not accept dollars. They will only want Bitcoin for the home. So, I mean, I think that, and that's going to change so many things in the real estate market, which is going to have an impact on other areas. So Brett can argue with me and say that that's not going to happen. We'll just have to see. I mean, we'll see in 15 years what's going on. But I believe that ultimately, people are going to want Bitcoin for these things, and it's going to drive that final stage towards unit of account where people are going to be pricing things in Bitcoin, not in dollars. So Brett can laugh at that and say I'm crazy, but I actually think that's going to happen. So we'll just have to see what goes down.
It's fine for you to believe that, Alex, but in the meantime, you don't get to talk about it in monetary terms. You've got to speak about it in what it currently actually is. Right. And that's the problem here.
So it's a monetizing.
In a situation where it actually operated as money, fine, you use monetary terminology. You can use terms like exchange rates. You can use terms like deflation. Yeah. Until then, you don't get to use that.
Well, I could do whatever I want, dude. So it's it's a store of value. It's a store of value, and it's a medium of exchange for some people, and it's a unit of account for a smaller amount of people. And it definitely has an exchange rate. But hold on. It definitely has an exchange rate, obviously. And currencies have market caps too. The Russian ruble has a market cap. So
what also this also has an exchange rate by your definition. Then, right? I can also sell this for stuff and then get money. I mean, this is
sure.
You're just kind of debasing language, basically. And I used to sell books. I've sold 35 books for Bitcoin, right? But I actually would never use the term sell nowadays. What I would use the term is counter trade. Counter trade is a process by which you take one object priced in money and you compare it to another object priced in money, which are two bidirectional flows, and then you compare them against each other, and then you basically cancel out the money and you work out an exchange ratio. And that's how all Bitcoin transactions work. If you're actually buying, quote unquote, buying real goods and services, you're counter trading. Okay, now that's great. And if you're gonna use that argument, then fine. That's an interesting argument, right? We can say there's a whole counter trade market where you can pass these objects in exchange for things. But again, don't confuse it for being an actual monetary system. And the other thing to also mention is there's all this like saber rattling about the loss of purchasing power. I mean, if you look, for example, at $1 in 1920 and you compare it to $1 in 2010, right? You're going to tell me one thing. You're going to say it's lost purchasing power. Do you think a person in 1920 was getting more stuff than a person in 2010? I guarantee you that a person in 2010 has way more
Brett,
stuff.
I'm going to have to cut you off there. Okay, Alex, I can give you 15 seconds to respond, and then unfortunately we're done with this episode.
I think it's like these are really important things to debate, and I'm glad to do this with Brett. Obviously, we just have different perspectives. I think it's unfair to like to just say that Bitcoin is not a money because people use it. I'll just give one last 5-second example. Like when we give grants out from our foundation to people working on this, they want Bitcoin. They don't want dollars. So, I mean, you can call that whatever you want, but they receive it in Bitcoin and then a lot of them spend it in Bitcoin. So that's happening. So we'll see. We'll see if this continues to grow or if it's just a momentary phenomenon.
Okay, well, folks, that's all the time we have for this episode of Coin Toss. Thanks again to our guests, Brett Scott and Alex Gladstein. You can tune in every Wednesday at 7:30 a.m. Pacific, 10:30 a.m. Eastern for new debates with reasonable people saying occasionally unreasonable things. And coming up, stay tuned for The Hash at 12 p.m. Eastern. I'm Adam B. Levine, and until next week, keep the conversation going.